There are two things I can tell you about my first week of work at Senior Support Services. One is that everything was so overwhelming and that I felt like I was walking through a thick haze. Two is that I met a man named George Jackson, a man whom I will never forget. George Jackson, one of the first names I learned. George Jackson, one of the first people I worked alongside of and with. George Jackson, a 62-year-old African-American male. George Jackson, homeless. George was at the center almost every day. He always sat in the same spot, typically sleeping, with his cab hat on and his shoes off. We often worked on housing together, George and I, and George needed to get into some low-income housing real bad. Living on the streets and sleeping in shelters just wasn't cutting it. I slowly saw George's health deteriorate in those first few months. Eventually, there came a time when George was frequently asking for money for prescription medications and was even hospitalized on several different occasions. Then, one day, somehow, I got the call. A nurse from Denver Health called asking if we had any record of a George Jackson. I told her that we did and gave her the emergency contact information we had for him. The nurse informed me that George was in the hospital and told me that if they were unsuccessful in finding a contact for him, that I would be on the list to make any decisions for George. After the nurse took down my contact information and said she would be in touch, I asked if I could come and see him. She said yes. The rest of the day was hectic. Things were crazy at the center, and it wasn't until I finally got home and sat down that I remembered about George. That night, before I fell asleep, I thought to myself, please, let him still be alive tomorrow so that I can go and see him. The next day, I received another phone call from the nurse, informing me that they had indeed found a contact for George. They had found the contact information of his ex-wife as well as a cousin, so I was off the hook. I must admit, I was definitely relieved and again asked if I could still come to see him. She said yes, and we both hung up the phone. Not a minute later did I get a call back from the nurse saying that she had just walked past George's room and that he was no longer there. She informed me that George's ex-wife had made the decision last night to cut his life support. George was one of the most gentle men I have met this year. It was within the next few days that I had found out that George was most likely murdered. George had seen an attack in the Triangle Park area and was going to go to court to testify against the culprits. It is suspected that the individuals who George was going to testify against were those who attacked him, knocking him unconscious and leaving him to die. This year in December, I went to the Homeless Persons Memorial Vigil, in which they say the names of those who died homeless and on the streets. George's name was on that list. After every name that was announced, the crowd responded back in unison. We will remember. George Jackson, a friend. George Jackson, a son. George Jackson, a kind, gentle, sweet man. George Jackson, a man who chose to stand up against injustice. George Jackson, a person who stole a piece of my heart and a person who I cannot wait to be united with again someday. George Jackson, I will remember. I wish I could have visited George before he left this world, or that I could have been there when the cords were pulled to hold his hand and remind him that he was not alone and was loved dearly. And I wish I could have gone up to that podium on that chilly December night and read these words. However, I know that George is in a better place. A place where he no longer experiences pain and hardship, a place where he belongs.